In the spring of 1944, on a remote airfield in the Philippines, a team of Imperial Japanese Navy pilots gathered around an enemy aircraft that had crash-landed nearly intact. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat, with its distinctive blue-gray paint and White Star insignia, represented everything Japanese engineers thought impossible: a fighter heavier than a bomber that could still outrun, outclimb, and outfight the legendary Zero. What happened when Japan's finest test pilots climbed into that cockpit and pushed the throttle forward would shatter assumptions, trigger desperate engineering initiatives, and reveal a technological gap so wide that no amount of courage or skill could bridge it. This is the story of pride confronting reality, of samurai spirit meeting industrial mathematics, and of the men who had to write reports their superiors did not want to read. Subscribe now if you want the untold stories of aerial warfare, the technical battles behind the dogfights, and the human costs of engineering decisions. We go deeper than any other channel. Hit that button and let's dive in. April 7, 1944, Clarkfield, Pampanga Province, Luzon, Philippines. The morning air is thick with humidity, carrying the smell of aviation fuel, volcanic soil, and burning sugar cane from distant fields. Lieutenant Commander Minoru Genda stands on the tarmac, hands clasped behind his back, studying the aircraft before him. The Grumman F-6 F-3 Hellcat sits at an angle. Its landing gear collapsed on one side, propeller blades bent from the forced landing 3 days prior. The American pilot ejected successfully and was captured, then died from injuries during interrogation. His aircraft remained. Genda is 40 years old, one of the most respected tactical minds in the Imperial Japanese Navy, an architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, a combat veteran with experience few can match. He has flown nearly every fighter in the Japanese inventory. Today he will fly an American one. The Hellcat was recovered from a rice paddy 7 kilometers east of Clark, brought to the airfield on wooden rollers pulled by water buffalo in a commandeered truck. Naval technicians from the Yokosuka Technical Arsenal, flown to the Philippines specifically for this evaluation, have spent 72 hours making the aircraft airworthy. They replaced the damaged propeller with one salvaged from another downed Hellcat. They repaired hydraulic lines. They patched bullet holes in the fuselage with sheet aluminum and fabric dope. They filled the fuel tanks with captured American 100-octane aviation gasoline, a grade Japan cannot produce domestically. The engine, a Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows, producing 2,000 horsepower, is undamaged. It represents more power than any Japanese aircraft engine in production. Genda has read the technical specifications and intelligence reports. On paper, the Hellcat seems impossible. It weighs 12,600 pounds fully loaded, more than twice the weight of the Mitsubishi A6M0. Yet American pilots claim it can reach 380 miles per hour in level flight. The Zero, at 6,000 pounds, struggles to exceed 330 miles per hour. How can a heavier aircraft fly faster? Genda intends to find out. Behind Genda, 3 other pilots wait. Lieutenant Saburo Sakai, one of Japan's leading aces with 64 confirmed victories, recovering from head wounds sustained in combat 6 months earlier. Lieutenant Hiroyoshi Nishizawa, the most lethal pilot in the Imperial Navy with 87 confirmed kills, a quiet man with unsettling eyes. And Lieutenant Junior Grade Toshio Ota, a test pilot from Yokosuka with 500 hours in experimental aircraft. Each man has been selected for skill, experience, and discretion. What they learn today will be classified. The evaluation is being conducted under direct orders from Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, commander of the Mobile Fleet, who needs accurate intelligence on American fighter capabilities before the next major naval engagement. The Americans have been routing Japanese fighters in every recent engagement. Losses are catastrophic. The Navy needs to understand why. Genda walks slowly around the Hellcat, examining every detail. The aircraft is massive, thick-bodied, brutal in its lines. No elegance, no grace, pure function. The wings are mid-mounted, folding for carrier storage, with 6.50 caliber Browning machine guns, 3 per wing. Genda knows these weapons. He has read reports from Germany about captured American machine guns. High rate of fire, extreme reliability, devastating effectiveness. The Zero carries 2 7.7mm machine guns and 2 20mm cannons. Lower total weight of fire. The Hellcat's armament advantage is significant. The cockpit sits high, providing excellent visibility. The canopy is a frameless bubble, offering an unrestricted view in all directions. The Zero's canopy has structural frames that create blind spots. Small difference, perhaps, but in combat, blind spots kill. Genda climbs onto the wing root, pulls himself up to the cockpit. The seat is wide, cushioned, adjustable. American pilots are larger on average than Japanese pilots, and their equipment reflects this. Everything in the cockpit is labeled in English. Genda reads English adequately, learned it during a naval staff posting to London in 1937. The instrument panel is logical. well organized, with large, easily readable gauges. The throttle quadrant on the left side features multiple levers: throttle, propeller pitch, mixture control, supercharger setting. The Zero has only a throttle and propeller pitch control. The additional controls suggest a more sophisticated engine management system. Agenda examines the oxygen system, the radio equipment, the gun charging handles. Everything is robust, over-engineered, built to survive combat damage. He compares this mentally to the Zero, which is lightweight, delicate, designed to maximize performance through minimal structure. Two different philosophies. One prioritizes performance through lightness. The other prioritizes survivability through strength. A Japanese mechanic, Petty Officer First Class Kenji Yamamoto, climbs up beside Genda to provide a cockpit briefing. Yamamoto was an engineer at Nakajima Aircraft before the war, conscripted in 1942, assigned to technical intelligence work because of his engineering background. He has studied the Hellcat systems obsessively for 3 days. He explains the startup procedure: battery on fuel selector to main tank, mixture rich, propeller full forward, throttle 1 inch forward, magnetos to both, primer 3 strokes, energized starter. The procedure is more complex than Japanese aircraft, but logical. Yamamoto warns that the R2800 engine produces tremendous torque on takeoff, requiring significant right rudder input to counteract left-turning tendency. He also warns that the aircraft is heavy, requiring higher takeoff speed than any Japanese fighter. Genda nods, commits the information to memory. Yamamoto wishes him good fortune and climbs down. Genda straps in using the American harness system, shoulder straps and lap belt, more secure than Japanese harnesses. He adjusts the seat height, tests the rudder pedals, wraps his hands around the control stick. The stick is heavier than the Zero's, requiring more force to move. He scans the instruments one more time, then signals the ground crew. An auxiliary power unit starts, providing electrical power. Genda follows the startup sequence: battery switch on, fuel selector to main, mixture rich, propeller control full forward, magnetos to both. He primes the engine 3 times, feeling resistance in the plunger. He presses the starter button. The engine cranks slowly, then catches with a deep, thunderous roar that vibrates through the entire airframe. 18 cylinders firing in sequence produce a sound unlike any Japanese engine: deeper, more powerful, a mechanical roar that speaks of raw industrial might. The propeller spins up, a massive 4-bladed Hamilton Standard unit that bites the air with authority. Genda checks oil pressure, fuel pressure, cylinder head temperature. All gauges show normal operating parameters. He looks to the left and right, confirming the area is clear, then advances the throttle slightly. The Hellcat begins to roll forward slowly, heavily. Genda applies brake pressure, testing the brake system. The brakes are hydraulic, powerful, more effective than the pneumatic brakes on Japanese aircraft. He taxis toward the runway, asterning to see around the long nose. The visibility on the ground is poor, the engine cowling blocking the forward view completely. Japanese fighters have better ground visibility. Another trade-off. Genda reaches the runway threshold, turns into the wind, runs through the pre-takeoff checklist. Mixture rich. Propeller full forward. Flaps down 15 degrees. Elevator trim slightly nose up. Fuel selector checked. He advances the throttle to full military power. The engine roars. The aircraft strains against the brakes, trembling with restrained power. Genda releases the brakes. The Hellcat leaps forward. The acceleration is brutal, shocking, unlike anything Genda has experienced in a fighter aircraft. The Zero accelerates gently, gracefully. The Hellcat accelerates like a truck, like a locomotive, pressing Genda back into his seat with raw force. He applies heavy right rudder to counteract the torque, more rudder than he expected, fighting the aircraft's desire to swing left. The tail comes up quickly at 40 knots. At 80 knots, he eases back on the stick. The Hellcat lifts off smoothly, climbing away from the runway with authority. Genda retracts the landing gear, watching the hydraulic pressure gauge as the wheels fold up into the wings. Smooth operation. He retracts the flaps, feels the aircraft accelerate. He trims the elevator for climb, reduces power slightly to cruise climb setting. 2,400 RPM and 35 inches of manifold pressure. The engine settles into a deep, steady thunder. The Hellcat climbs at 3,000 feet per minute, twice the Zero's initial climb rate. Genda levels off at 10,000 feet, checks the engine instruments, everything normal. He is alone in the sky over central Luzon, flying an enemy aircraft, searching for truth. He begins with basic handling tests. Turns to the left, turns to the right, steep banks at 60 degrees. The Hellcat responds smoothly but heavily. The controls require significant force, far more than the Zero. The stick forces are high, the control harmony is different, less sensitive. Zero is light on the controls, responsive to the slightest input, almost telepathic in its connection to the pilot. The Hellcat is blunt, requiring deliberate input, but the responses are predictable, solid, without visas. Jenda tries a loop. He dives to build speed, pulls back hard on the stick. The Hellcat loops reluctantly, requiring significant altitude loss to complete. The Zero loops effortlessly, hanging on the propeller at the top. Different aircraft, different capabilities. He tries a barrel roll. The Hellcat rolls slowly, ponderous, taking nearly 4 seconds to complete 360 degrees. The Zero rolls instantly, 1 second or less. In a turning fight, the Zero would dominate this aircraft. But turning fights are not the whole story. Jenda levels at 15,000 feet, adjusts the throttle to maximum continuous power, 2,600 RPM, and 40 inches of manifold pressure. He allows the aircraft to accelerate, watching the airspeed indicator climb 250 knots, 280 knots, 300 knots. The Hellcat continues accelerating, smooth and stable, 320 knots. Still accelerating. The airspeed indicator shows 330 knots, approximately 380 miles per hour. The aircraft is level, steady, the engine running smoothly within normal operating limits. Jenda maintains this speed for 5 minutes, checking the engine instruments constantly. Temperature is normal. Oil pressure is normal. The aircraft shows no signs of stress, no vibration, no instability. 380 miles per hour in level flight, as the American specifications claimed. The Zero's maximum speed is 287 miles per hour, and that is achieved with the engine at maximum power, redlined, operating at the edge of destruction. The Hellcat cruises at 380 miles per hour without strain. Jenda feels something cold settle in his chest. This is not a minor performance advantage. This is a fundamental transformation of aerial combat. If the enemy can choose when to engage and when to disengage, if they can run down any Japanese fighter or escape from any unfavorable situation, then tactical skill becomes partially irrelevant. Speed is life. Speed is choice. Speed is control. He conducts dive tests next. He rolls the Hellcat inverted and pulls through into a vertical dive. The airspeed builds rapidly, 350 knots, 400 knots, 450 knots. The control forces increase dramatically, the stick requiring both hands to move, but the aircraft remains stable, solid, no flutter, no buffeting. At 500 knots, Jenda begins the recovery, pulling back on the stick with all his strength. The G-forces press him into the seat, the aircraft groaning under the load, but the structure holds. The wings do not deform. The control surfaces do not fail. He levels off at 8,000 feet, having lost 12,000 feet in the dive. The Zero, if subjected to a dive at 500 knots, would experience structural failure. Its lightweight airframe cannot withstand such forces. Japanese pilots are trained to avoid diving at excessive speed because the aircraft cannot survive it. The Hellcat, heavier, stronger, survives effortlessly. This means American pilots can dive away from any engagement. Japanese pilots cannot follow. The tactical implications are devastating. Jenda climbs back to 20,000 feet to test high-altitude performance. The Zero is optimized for combat below 20,000 feet. Above that altitude, its performance degrades rapidly due to lack of supercharger boost. The Hellcat has a 2-stage supercharger, automatically adjusting for altitude. At 20,000 feet, Jenda tests acceleration, turns, climbs. The Hellcat's performance remains strong, barely degraded. The engine produces full power. The controls remain responsive. He climbs to 25,000 feet, still strong. At 30,000 feet, the performance begins to decline, but the aircraft remains controllable, functional. The Zero at 30,000 feet is nearly unflyable, wallowing, unresponsive, the engine starving for oxygen. The Hellcat owns the high-altitude fight. Japanese pilots have no answer. He descends to 10,000 feet and conducts mock combat maneuvers against imaginary opponents. He tries scissors, rolling scissors, high yo-yos, low yo-yos, every defensive maneuver he knows. The Hellcat's heavy controls and slow roll rate make it inferior to the Zero in sustained turning combat. But Jenda realizes that American pilots would never fight that way. Why would they? They can accelerate away, climb away, dive away. They can choose the engagement parameters. They can attack, and if the attack fails, they can escape. Japanese pilots, once engaged, must commit. They cannot escape. They must win or die. The Americans can disengage and try again. This is not a fair fight. This is a mathematical slaughter waiting to happen. After 1 hour and 15 minutes, Jenda returns to Clarkfield. The landing is uneventful, heavy, but stable. Taxis back to the apron, shuts down the engine, sits in silence for 30 seconds before removing his flight helmet. Saburo Sakai approaches as Jenda climbs out of the cockpit. Sakai asks what Jenda thinks. Jenda looks at him, then looks back at the Hellcat, then says quietly, "We are fighting with wooden swords against steel. Everything we believed about fighter combat is obsolete." Sakai's expression does not change, but something flickers in his eyes. Fear, perhaps. Or recognition. Sakai flies next. Sakai's flight profile is more aggressive than Genda's. He tests the Hellcat's limits in ways Genda, careful and methodical, did not. He performs violent snap rolls, near vertical climbs, sustained high G turns. He discovers that the Hellcat can sustain 6 G maneuvers without structural damage, while the Zero's maximum is 4.5 G before the wings begin to buckle. He discovers that the Hellcat's stall characteristics are benign, the aircraft providing clear warning buffet and recovering easily with forward stick. The Zero's stall characteristics are vicious, snapping into a spin without warning. He discovers that the Hellcat can absorb battle damage that would destroy a Zero. The airframe is thick, redundant, strong. The engine has redundant ignition systems continuing to run even if one magneto fails. The fuel system is self-sealing, the tanks lined with rubber that swells when punctured, closing the hole. The cockpit armor, thick plates of steel behind the seat and headrest, stops rifle-caliber bullets easily. The Zero has no armor, no self-sealing tanks, minimal redundancy. One bullet in the fuel tank, the Zero burns. One bullet in the engine, the Zero dies. The design philosophy is clear. Japanese aircraft are optimized for maximum performance through minimum weight. American aircraft are optimized for survivability through maximum protection. In 1941, when Japanese pilots were elite, highly trained, experienced, the performance advantage won battles. In 1944, when Japanese pilots are increasingly inexperienced, poorly trained, flying against veterans, survivability determines outcomes. Sakai lands, climbs out of the cockpit. His face is expressionless, but he is sweating heavily despite the high altitude. Nishizawa asks him what he found. Sakai lights a cigarette, takes a long drag, then says, "It does not matter how skilled we are. This aircraft can kill us whenever it chooses." Nishizawa flies third. His flight is the shortest, only 45 minutes. He performs high-speed passes, evaluating the Hellcat's energy retention, its ability to regain altitude after a dive. He discovers that the Hellcat's heavy weight, a disadvantage in turning, is an advantage in energy fighting. A diving Hellcat carries tremendous momentum. It can convert that momentum into altitude or speed almost losslessly. The Zero, light and draggy, bleeds energy rapidly. In combat, the Hellcat can dictate the terms. Boom and zoom. Dive, attack, climb away. Repeat. The Zero pilot can only evade and hope. Nishizawa lands, says nothing, walks away from the aircraft. His hands are shaking. Toshio Ota flies last, conducting detailed instrumented tests with data recording equipment installed in the rear cockpit area. His flight lasts 2 hours. He systematically documents every performance parameter, speeds at various altitudes, climb rates, fuel consumption, control forces, acceleration times, turn rates at different speeds, raw data, numbers, objective truth. That evening, the 4 pilots gather in a requisitioned plantation house 3 kilometers from Clarkfield, now serving as a temporary headquarters for the evaluation team. The house is Spanish colonial style, thick adobe walls, tile roof, wooden shutters closed against the heat. Ceiling fans turn slowly overhead, moving air that smells of mildew and insect repellent. The pilots sit around a large wooden table covered with charts, graphs, performance data sheets. Genda has been writing his report for 2 hours, handwritten in careful kanji on military forms. The conclusion is unavoidable, supported by every test flight, every measurement, every observation. The F6F Hellcat is superior to the A6M0 in every performance category except low-speed maneuverability. Speed, climb, dive, high-altitude performance, armament, protection, range, reliability, all favor the American aircraft. The performance gap is not marginal, it is categorical. But Genda's report goes deeper than performance specifications. He analyzes tactical implications. American pilots flying Hellcats can engage Japanese formations at will, attack from superior altitude and speed, disengage before Japanese fighters can respond. They can choose to fight only when conditions favor them. They can avoid unfavorable engagements entirely. Japanese pilots flying Zeros have no such options. They must accept battle on American terms or refuse to fly at all. Refusing to fly is not an option. Therefore, Japanese pilots must enter combat knowing they are outmatched, hoping that courage and skill can overcome engineering. Sometimes it can. Usually it cannot. The mathematics of attrition are brutal. If the Americans have a 60% advantage in each engagement, they do not need to be better pilots. They just need to keep fighting. Eventually, the Japanese will run out of pilots, out of aircraft, out of time. Genda writes recommendations. Japan must immediately develop a new generation fighter aircraft matching or exceeding Hellcat performance. This will require engines producing 2,000 horsepower or more, engines Japan cannot currently manufacture. It will require stronger airframes, heavier structures, accepting weight penalties in exchange for survivability. It will require abandoning the lightweight fighter philosophy that has dominated, Japanese thinking since the 1920s. It will require fundamental changes to doctrine, training, tactics. It will require admitting that American engineering is superior, that Japanese assumptions were wrong, that the path forward requires learning from the enemy. These recommendations are politically dangerous. The Imperial Navy's leadership is dominated by men who believe in Japanese spiritual superiority, who insist that willpower can overcome material disadvantage. Genda knows his report will be unpopular. He writes it anyway. Sakai contributes a pilot's perspective to the report. He describes what it feels like to fly the Hellcat after years of flying the Zero. He writes about the psychological impact of heavy controls, of poor low-speed handling, of the constant fear of being outmaneuvered. Then he writes about the revelation of understanding that American pilots never intend to dogfight. They use speed and altitude. They attack and escape. They fight smart, not brave. He writes, "We have been training our pilots to win dogfights. The Americans have been training their pilots to avoid dogfights. Their strategy is superior because their aircraft supports it. Our strategy is obsolete because our aircraft cannot adapt." He recommends immediate changes to Japanese tactical doctrine, emphasizing speed and altitude over maneuverability, hit-and-run attacks over sustained engagement. But these tactics require aircraft that can perform them. The Zero cannot. Therefore, the Zero must be replaced. But with what? Japan has no replacement in production. Nishizawa's contribution is brief, brutal, nihilistic. He writes, "I have killed 87 enemy aircraft. I believed I could kill any pilot in any aircraft if my skill was greater. This was arrogance. The Hellcat proves that engineering defeats skill. An average American pilot in a Hellcat will defeat an excellent Japanese pilot in a Zero if the American pilot understands his aircraft's advantages. We are not losing because our pilots lack courage. We are losing because our pilots lack airplanes." He does not offer recommendations. He sees no path forward. OTA's contribution is pure data. 30 pages of charts, tables, graphs, performance curves. His covering note is one sentence. "These numbers represent an enemy we cannot defeat with current equipment." The 4 documents are compiled into a single report, classified top secret, addressed to Admiral Ozawa through the chain of command. The report is hand-carried to Manila on April 9th by a staff officer placed aboard a transport aircraft flying to Truk Atoll, then transferred to a seaplane flying to Saipan, finally delivered to Ozawa's flagship, the carrier Taiho, on April 13, 1944. Ozawa reads the report over 2 days. He is a realist, a professional naval officer who understands industrial warfare. He knows Japan is losing the production war. He knows American shipyards are launching carriers faster than Japanese shipyards can repair damaged ones. He knows American factories are producing aircraft by the tens of thousands while Japanese factories struggle to produce hundreds. The Hellcat report confirms what he has suspected. The qualitative gap is widening along with the quantitative gap. Japan is being crushed between material inferiority and numerical inferiority. There is no good option, only degrees of disaster. Ozawa forwards the report to Tokyo to the Naval General Staff with his endorsement. He writes that the findings are accurate, that the conclusions are sound, that action must be taken immediately. He does not expect action will be taken. The report arrives at the Navy Ministry building in Tokyo on April 20th, 1944. It is read by a staff officer in the technical branch, Captain Toshio Naito, an engineer by training, a bureaucrat by necessity. Naito has read dozens of reports like this over the past year, each one describing American technical superiority in some domain: radar, radios, engines, metallurgy, electronics. Each report is filed, discussed in meetings that accomplish nothing, then forgotten. The institutional response to bad news is paralysis. Admitting American superiority implies Japanese inferiority, a thought that is ideologically unacceptable. The Navy's leadership, dominated by graduates of the Imperial Japanese Naval Academy at Etajima, men raised in a culture of Bushido and belief in Japanese exceptionalism, cannot process evidence that contradicts their worldview. So the evidence is reinterpreted, dismissed, or ignored. Naito knows the Hellcat report will follow this pattern. He tries anyway. He writes a cover memorandum to the Vice Chief of the Naval General Staff, Vice Admiral Shigeru Fukudome, summarizing the report's findings and recommending 3 immediate actions. Accelerate development of the A-7M Reppu fighter, the planned Zero replacement. Begin production of the J-2M Raiden interceptor, a high-speed, heavily armed alternative to the Zero. And implement defensive armament upgrades to existing Zero fighters, including self-sealing fuel tanks and pilot armor, accepting performance penalties in exchange for survivability. These recommendations are technically sound, operationally necessary, and politically impossible. The A-7M program is years behind schedule, plagued by engine problems. The Mitsubishi HA-43 engine, designed to produce 2,000 horsepower, achieves only 1,800 horsepower and suffers catastrophic failures at high power settings. The J2M has entered production but is unpopular with pilots due to poor forward visibility and difficult handling characteristics. Retrofitting self-sealing tanks to Zeros would reduce production rates and ground existing aircraft for modifications. None of these solutions are easy. All of them are necessary. NATO submits his memorandum on April 25th. Fukudome reads the report and memorandum on April 27th. He is 60 years old, a veteran of the Russo-Japanese War, a man who believes in Japanese spirit as a material force. He is also intelligent enough to recognize reality when confronted with overwhelming evidence. He calls a meeting of senior technical staff for April 30th to discuss the Hellcat report and formulate a response. 12 officers attend, representing various technical bureaus, operational commands, and procurement offices. The meeting begins at 0900 hours in a fourth-floor conference room overlooking the Imperial Palace grounds. The windows are covered with blackout curtains despite the daylight, a security precaution. The air is stale, cigarette smoke from previous meetings still hanging in the corners. Fukudome opens by reading selected passages from the Hellcat report aloud, his voice flat, emotionless. The room is silent. When Fukudome finishes reading, he asks for responses. No one speaks for 30 seconds. Then, Captain Masatake Okumiya, an operations officer, argues that the report's conclusions are exaggerated. That the test pilots were demoralized by flying an enemy aircraft, that psychological factors biased their assessments. He suggests that the Hellcat's advantages are real, but can be overcome through superior tactics and pilot training. Others nod in agreement. This is comfortable territory, blaming outcomes on human factors rather than technical factors. NATO responds immediately. He reminds the room that the test pilots included Minoru Genda, architect of Pearl Harbor, one of the Navy's most respected tactical minds. He reminds them that Saburo Sakai has 64 confirmed victories, that Hiroyoshi Nishizawa has 87. These are not demoralized pilots. These are Japan's best. If they say the Hellcat is superior, it is superior. The room goes quiet again. Another officer, Commander Jiro Tanaka from the Aircraft Design Bureau, argues that the Zero was designed in 1937, that comparing it to a 1943 American design is unfair, that Japan's next-generation fighters will close the performance gap. NATO asks when these next-generation fighters will enter service in significant numbers. Tanaka hesitates. The A-7M is projected for late 1945 at the earliest. The N1KJ Shiden is in production but limited numbers, and its performance is only marginally better than the Zero. The J2M production is slow, and the aircraft is unpopular. NATO states the obvious. The war will not wait for 1945. The Americans are coming now. They have hundreds of Hellcats now. Thousands more are being produced every month. Japan's response must be immediate, not theoretical. Tanaka has no answer. The discussion continues for 2 hours, circling the same points. The technical staff understand the problem but see no solution. Japan's engine technology lags America's by 3 to 5 years. Japan's industrial capacity is 1/10 of America's. Japan's aluminum supply is critically limited, forcing use of substitute materials that are heavier and weaker. Japan's pilot training program has been shortened from 3 years to 6 months due to fuel shortages and instructor losses. Every dimension of the problem is interconnected. Fixing one dimension without fixing the others accomplishes nothing. Fixing all dimensions simultaneously is impossible. The meeting ends without resolution. Fukudome orders the technical staff to prepare recommendations for the next meeting, scheduled for May 15th. Everyone knows the second meeting will be as fruitless as the first. Meanwhile, in the Philippines, the Hellcat evaluation program continues. Additional captured Hellcats are recovered from crash sites, brought to Clarkfield, repaired, tested. By late April 1944, the Japanese have 6 flyable Hellcats, enough to conduct advanced trials. Combat simulations are organized, pairing Hellcats against Zeros in mock engagements. The results are one-sided. Even when flown by average pilots, Hellcats dominate. The Zero pilots cannot force engagements, cannot escape unfavorable situations, cannot match the Hellcat's speed or climb. In one simulation, a Hellcat pilot deliberately allows a Zero to achieve a favorable position, a 6 o'clock tail position, a killing position. The Zero pilot opens fire at 300 meters, his 20mm cannons reaching out. The Hellcat pilot pushes the throttle forward and dives. The Zero follows. At 400 knots, the Zero's airframe begins to shudder, the wings flexing dangerously. The pilot must pull out or risk structural failure. The Hellcat continues diving, accelerating, opening the range effortlessly. At 500 knots, the Hellcat pulls out of the dive and climbs back to altitude, untouched. The Zero, slower, heavier, less efficient in the climb, takes 3 minutes longer to regain altitude. By then, the Hellcat has repositioned, gained altitude advantage, reset the engagement. The Zero pilot can do nothing. One of the Japanese observers, a senior instructor from the Fighter Training Command, watches this simulation and afterwards sits on the ground, head in hands, saying nothing for 10 minutes. The psychological impact on Japanese pilots witnessing these tests is severe. For 3 years, they have believed in their aircraft, in their training, in their superiority. The Zero's early war dominance seemed to confirm this belief. Now they see that the dominance was temporary, situational, dependent on factors that no longer exist. American pilots in 1941 were untrained, poorly equipped, tactically naive. American pilots in 1944 are experienced, superbly equipped, tactically sophisticated. The Zero was superior to the Brewster Buffalo and the F-4F Wildcat. It is not superior to the F-6F Hellcat or the P-38 Lightning or the P-51 Mustang. The war has changed. The Japanese have not. The gap between perception and reality is creating a crisis of confidence among frontline units. Pilots are requesting transfers to bomber units, to reconnaissance units, to anywhere that does not require flying Zeros against Hellcats. Requests are denied. There are no other units. Everyone must fight. In May 1944, a second series of tests begins, focusing on armament effectiveness. The 6 Hellcats, 50 caliber machine guns are test-fired against captured Japanese aircraft structures. Zero wings, fuselages, engine cowlings. The results are devastating. The .50 caliber rounds punch through Zero airframes with ease, the thin aluminum skin offering no resistance. A single hit to the fuel tank causes immediate catastrophic fire due to lack of self-sealing. Multiple hits to the engine cause instant failure, the unarmored cylinders shattering. Hits to the cockpit area kill the pilot instantly, the lack of armor providing zero protection. The Japanese armament experts calculate that a 1-second burst from a Hellcat's 6 machine guns, approximately 80 rounds total, is sufficient to destroy a Zero. By contrast, Zero armament is tested against a Hellcat airframe. The 7.7mm machine gun rounds bounce off the Hellcat's armor plate, leaving only scratches. The 20mm cannon rounds penetrate the airframe but often fail to cause catastrophic damage. The Hellcat's fuel tanks seal automatically. The engine continues running with multiple cylinder hits. The pilot, protected by thick steel armor, survives. It takes an average of 40 20mm hits to down a Hellcat. The Japanese pilots need 40 hits. The American pilots need 1 hit. This is not a fair fight. One of the Japanese test pilots, Lieutenant Junior Grade Yasuhiko Kuro, writes a private letter to his family after participating in the armament tests. The letter is discovered decades later in family archives, published in a 1987 historical journal. Kuro writes, "I have seen the future, and it is fire. We are flying paper airplanes against metal fortresses. When I climb into my Zero now, I do not wonder if I will be shot down. I wonder only when. My aircraft is my coffin. I have made peace with this. I will die. Well, but I'm angry that our leaders sent us to fight with inadequate tools. Courage cannot stop bullets. Spirit cannot seal a burning fuel tank. We needed better aircraft 3 years ago. Now it is too late. Forgive me for not coming home." Kuro is killed in action on June 19, 1944, during the Battle of the Philippine Sea, shot down by a Hellcat from USS Lexington. He is 23 years old. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, June 19 to 20, 1944. Becomes the ultimate validation of everything the Hellcat test program revealed. The Japanese attack with 373 carrier aircraft, mostly Zeros with some newer types. The Americans defend with 450 fighters, mostly Hellcats. The result is a massacre. The Americans shoot down 315 Japanese aircraft in 2 days, losing 23 of their own. The kill ratio is 13.7 to 1. American pilots call it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Japanese name it differently, the end of the mobile fleet as an effective force. The reasons for the catastrophic losses are multiple. Poorly trained Japanese pilots, excellent American radar-controlled interception, superior American tactics, but underlying everything is the hardware advantage. Hellcats simply outperformed Zeros in every dimension that mattered in that battle. Speed allowed American pilots to intercept Japanese formations before they reached the carriers. Climb allowed them to gain altitude advantage. Firepower allowed them to destroy Japanese aircraft quickly and efficiently. Protection allowed them to survive return fire. The Zero pilots, brave and committed, flew into a mechanical slaughterhouse. After the Philippine Sea battle, Admiral Ozawa requests an urgent meeting with the Naval General Staff. The meeting occurs June 25, 1944, in Tokyo. Ozawa presents casualty figures, aircraft losses, pilot losses. He presents the Hellcat report from April, now 3 months old, its predictions validated exactly. He demands immediate action, stop Zero production, redirect resources to advance fighters, implement crash programs for engine development, redesign training programs to emphasize survival over aggression. His recommendations are noted but not implemented. The bureaucracy moves slowly, the war moves fast. By July 1944, Japan has lost over 1,200 carrier-based aircraft and over 800 trained pilots. Replacements are arriving, but they are poorly trained. Flying inferior equipment sent against an enemy that grows stronger daily. The death spiral is underway. In August 1944, the Japanese capture another Hellcat, this time an F6F5, the improved model with better engine performance and upgraded armament. The aircraft is brought to the Yokosuka Naval Air Technical Arsenal, Japan's premier aircraft research facility, for detailed technical examination. Engineers disassemble the aircraft completely, photographing and measuring every component. The engine is torn down, every part weighed, analyzed, reverse engineered. The propeller is studied, its blade design and pitch control mechanism examined. The armament is tested. The .50 caliber machine guns fired thousands of rounds to determine mechanical principles. The goal is to copy successful features, integrate them into Japanese designs, close the performance gap through imitation. But imitation requires manufacturing capability. The Hellcat's R280M engine uses advanced metallurgy Japan cannot replicate, requiring heat-treated alloys Japan cannot produce. The propeller's constant speed mechanism requires precision machining Japan's factories cannot achieve. The .50 caliber machine gun requires manufacturing tolerances and quality control Japan's wartime production cannot maintain. Everything about the Hellcat reflects an industrial capacity Japan does not possess. The Yokosuka engineers write a report summarizing their findings. The report is 78 pages filled with technical drawings, metallurgical analyses, and manufacturing assessments. The conclusion is stark. Japan cannot build an aircraft equivalent to the F6F5 with current industrial capacity. Not in 1944, not in 1945, possibly not ever. The material requirements are beyond Japan's resource base. The manufacturing precision is beyond Japan's machine tool capabilities. The design philosophy requires an industrial infrastructure that takes decades to build, and Japan is running out of time measured in months. The report recommends focusing on asymmetric approaches. Smaller, lighter interceptors optimized for specific missions, rocket-powered aircraft for point defense, kamikaze tactics utilizing older aircraft. These recommendations represent desperation, the abandonment of conventional warfare in favor of unorthodox, sacrificial approaches. The report is classified and filed. Some of the recommendations are quietly implemented. The kamikaze program expands. By September 1944, the Hellcat evaluation program in the Philippines is shutting down. The advancing Allied forces make continued operations at Clarkfield untenable. The captured Hellcats are flown to Taiwan, then to Japan, some to Yokosuka, some to other research facilities. The pilots who participated in the evaluation program are scattered to various combat units. Genda is assigned to staff duty in Tokyo working on defensive strategies for the home islands. Sakai is medically retired due to his head injuries, partially blind in one eye. Nishizawa continues flying combat missions, accumulating victories, surviving by skill and luck until October 25, 1944, when he is killed not in air combat but as a passenger on a transport aircraft shot down by American fighters. Ote returns to test pilot duties at Yokosuka, flying experimental aircraft, writing reports no one reads. The knowledge they gain from flying the Hellcat disseminates slowly through the Japanese fighter community. But knowledge without actionable solutions is just despair. The A7M Repu, the fighter designed to replace the Zero and match the Hellcat, flies its first prototype in May 1944. The test flights reveal serious problems. The engine, the Mitsubishi HA-43, fails repeatedly. Cooling is inadequate, propeller vibration is excessive. The aircraft's speed, originally projected at 390 miles per hour, achieves only 360 miles per hour, barely better than the Zero and still inferior to the Hellcat. The program is months behind schedule. By the time these issues are resolved, if they are resolved, the war will likely be over. The backup plan, the J-2M Raiden, enters production in limited numbers but never replaces the Zero as the primary Navy fighter. The N-1 KJ Shiden, another Zero replacement, performs well but suffers from landing gear problems and enters production too late and in too few numbers. By late 1944, the vast majority of Japanese Navy fighters are still Zeros, still obsolete, still dying. The pilots know it. They fly anyway, there is no choice. In November 1944, a third major evaluation occurs, this time involving the P-51D Mustang. The Japanese capture Mustang in China, fly it to Japan, subjected to the same rigorous testing as the Hellcat. The results are even more discouraging. The Mustang is faster than the Hellcat, 440 miles per hour in level flight. It climbs better. It turns better. It dives better. It has longer range. It is in many respects the most capable fighter aircraft in the world in late 1944. The test pilots write reports that echo the Hellcat reports: superior American engineering, superior American industrial capacity, superior American design philosophy. The recommendations are identical. Japan must develop equivalent aircraft or face annihilation. The responses from leadership are identical. Note the findings, file the reports, continue current production. By November 1944, rational strategic planning has been abandoned. Japan is fighting for time, for a negotiating position, for a miracle. No one seriously believes victory is possible. The goal is to inflict sufficient casualties on the Americans that they negotiate a settlement rather than demanding unconditional surrender. The Hellcat reports, the Mustang reports, the endless stream of evidence of American technical superiority all support the same conclusion. This strategy will fail. The captured Hellcats and Mustangs are eventually used for a purpose beyond evaluation. They are used to train Japanese pilots in how to fight against these aircraft. Mock dogfights are conducted. Japanese pilots flying captured American fighters against Japanese pilots flying Zeros. The goal is to discover vulnerabilities, tactics that might give Zero pilots a chance. The training reveals some useful techniques. Never engage in level flight. Always attack from above or below. Use the Zero's superior low-speed handling to force overshoots. Never follow an American fighter into a dive. Disengage immediately if surprised. These tactics improve survival rates marginally, but only marginally. The fundamental problem remains. The Hellcat and Mustang can dictate engagement terms, and Zero pilots cannot. Tactical cleverness cannot overcome categorical performance disadvantage. By early 1945, most of the captured American fighters have been destroyed, either in Allied bombing raids or by accidents during test flights. A few survive, hidden at remote facilities, preserved for ongoing research. One Hellcat survives the war intact, stored at a facility near Nagoya. Discovered by American occupation forces in September 1945, it is repatriated to the United States, eventually ending up at a Naval Aviation Museum, still painted in Japanese markings, a physical artifact of the evaluation program. The Japanese test reports, many of them, are captured by American intelligence teams and translated. They are studied by American engineers, who are surprised by the accuracy and thoroughness of the Japanese analysis. The reports confirm that Japanese engineers understood their predicament clearly. They understood the performance gaps. They understood the tactical implications. They simply lacked the industrial capacity to respond. Post-war interviews with surviving Japanese test pilots reveal a common theme. Flying the Hellcat was psychologically devastating. It made concrete what they had suspected but not wanted to believe. They were fighting with obsolete equipment against a technologically superior enemy. Genda, in a 1960 interview with an American historian, says, "Flying the Hellcat was like a veil lifting. I suddenly understood why we were losing. It was not because our pilots lacked courage or skill. It was because our aircraft lacked capability. This was a terrible revelation. Courage is something you can summon. Capability is something you must build. We did not have time to build it." Sakai, in his 1957 autobiography Samurai, writes extensively about the Hellcat evaluation. He describes the physical sensation of the aircraft's power, the psychological impact of its speed, the tactical implications of its performance. He writes, "I knew after flying the Hellcat that the war was lost. Not eventually, immediately. We were already defeated. We just had not admitted it yet." The story of Japanese pilots flying captured Hellcats is not widely known in popular histories of World War II. It receives brief mentions in technical histories, footnotes in larger narratives, but the story is significant because it reveals the human dimension of technological warfare. The Japanese pilots who flew those captured aircraft were not stupid or incompetent. They were skilled professionals trying to solve an impossible problem. They conducted excellent research. They wrote accurate reports. They made sound recommendations. And they were ignored, not because their leadership was malicious, but because their leadership was trapped by ideology, by institutional inertia, by material limitations that no amount of willpower could overcome. The tragedy is not that Japan lost the air war. The tragedy is that Japan's leadership knew they were losing, had evidence they were losing, understood why they were losing, and chose to continue anyway because admitting defeat was culturally unacceptable. The technical comparison between the F-6F Hellcat and the A-6M0 is a case study in design philosophy. The Zero was designed in the late 1930s when Japanese naval doctrine emphasized long-range operations, carrier-based aviation, and air superiority through superior maneuverability. The Zero's lightweight construction, long range, and exceptional turning ability made it ideal for this role. It dominated early war combat because Allied fighters were designed for different missions and lacked the Zero's specific advantages. But the Zero's design made trade-offs that became liabilities as the war progressed. No armor meant pilots were vulnerable. No self-sealing fuel tanks meant fires were common and catastrophic. Lightweight structure meant fragility under battle damage. The Zero was a glass cannon, deadly but breakable. The Hellcat was designed in 1942 after the U.S. Navy had 2 years of combat experience against the Zero. American designers knew the Zero's strengths and deliberately designed the Hellcat to counter them. The Hellcat was heavier, stronger, faster. It could not outearn the Zero, but it did not need to. It fought on different terms, using speed and altitude and firepower to negate the Zero's maneuverability advantage. The Hellcat was a hammer, blunt but unstoppable. The engine technology gap between the two aircraft reflects broader industrial differences. The Zero's Nakajima Sake engine produced 1,130 horsepower from a 27.9-liter displacement. The Hellcat's Pratt & Whitney R2800 produced 2,000 horsepower from a 45.9-liter displacement. Both engines were air-cooled radials, but the American engine used superior metallurgy, better cooling design, and more advanced supercharging. The R2800 was reliable, running thousands of hours between overhauls. The Sakai was temperamental, requiring frequent maintenance and prone to failure at high power settings. The performance difference reflects not just design skill but manufacturing capability. American factories could produce engines to tighter tolerances using better materials with better quality control. Japanese factories by 1944 were using substitute materials, employing unskilled workers, operating under resource constraints. The decline in Japanese engine quality over the course of the war was dramatic. Early Warsake engines were excellent, late Warsake engines were unreliable. The Americans maintained consistent quality throughout. The armament gap was equally significant. The Zero's two 7.7mm Type 97 machine guns and two 20mm Type 99 cannons provided 1.7 kilograms of projectile weight per second. The Hellcat's 6.50 caliber M2 Browning machine guns provided 3.4 kilograms per second, double the Zero's output. Moreover, the American ammunition was more reliable, more consistent, and available in greater quantities. Japanese pilots frequently reported ammunition shortages, loading their aircraft with partial loads to conserve supplies. American pilots never faced this problem. The U.S. industrial base produced .50 caliber ammunition by the billions of rounds. Supply was effectively infinite. The psychological impact of unlimited ammunition versus rationed ammunition is subtle but real. A pilot who must conserve ammunition hesitates, waits for the perfect shot, loses opportunities. A pilot with unlimited ammunition fires freely, aggressively, confidently. Confidence wins fights. The protection gap extended beyond armor and self-sealing tanks. American aircraft used redundant systems throughout. Dual hydraulic systems meant that if one failed, the other continued operating. Dual electrical systems provided backup power. Dual ignition systems kept engines running even with partial failures. Japanese aircraft used single systems, minimizing weight and complexity but creating single points of failure. One bullet in the right place could disable a Zero completely. A Hellcat could absorb dozens of hits and keep flying. This redundancy was expensive, heavy, complex. American designers accepted these costs because American doctrine prioritized bringing pilots home alive. Japanese doctrine prioritized mission accomplishment over pilot survival. Both approaches reflect cultural values. American culture, individualistic and pragmatic, valued human life and trained personnel. Japanese culture, collective and idealistic, valued sacrifice and duty. Neither value system is inherently superior, but in industrial warfare, the system that preserves trained personnel has a compounding advantage. The pilot training gap compounded the hardware gap. American pilot training in 1944 included 300 hours of flight time before combat deployment. Japanese pilot training by 1944 included 100 hours or less. The Americans could afford extensive training because they had fuel, aircraft, and instructors. The Japanese rationed training because fuel was scarce. Aircraft were needed at the front, and experienced instructors were dead. The quality gap between American and Japanese pilots widened throughout the war. Not because Japanese pilots were less talented, but because they had less preparation. A poorly trained pilot in a superior aircraft might match a well-trained pilot in an inferior aircraft, but when the Americans had both superior aircraft and superior training, the outcome was inevitable. The Japanese test pilots who flew the Hellcat understood this. They were elite, highly trained, experienced. They represented the best Japan could produce, and even they acknowledged that average American pilots and Hellcats could defeat them through hardware advantage alone. The range advantage of the Hellcat over the Zero is often misunderstood. The Zero had longer absolute range, capable of flying missions exceeding 1,200 miles. The Hellcat's range was approximately 1,000 miles. But range in combat is not the same as range in transit. Combat maneuvering consumes fuel rapidly. A turning fight at full power can empty a fuel tank in minutes. The Zero's lack of self-sealing tanks meant that any fuel tank damage resulted in catastrophic fuel loss. The Hellcat's self-sealing tanks meant that even damaged tanks retained most of their fuel. In practice, Hellcats frequently returned to carriers with battle damage and partial fuel loads. Zeros frequently did not return at all, either shot down or forced to ditch due to fuel exhaustion. Effective range, the range at which an aircraft can fight and return, favored the Hellcat despite its lower absolute range. The Japanese test reports noted this but struggled to quantify it. How do you measure the value of coming home? The structural strength difference between the two aircraft is illustrated by their maximum dive speeds. The Zero's never-exceed speed was approximately 410 miles per hour. Exceeding this speed risked structural failure, control surface flutter, or loss of control. The Hellcat's never-exceed speed was approximately 540 miles per hour. This 130-mile-per-hour margin allowed American pilots enormous tactical flexibility. They could dive to escape, dive to attack, dive to build speed for a climbing attack. Japanese pilots could not follow. The inability to follow an enemy into a high-speed dive is a death sentence in air combat. It means the enemy can always escape. It means the enemy controls the engagement. The Zero was optimized for low-speed, high-altitude combat, dogfighting, maneuverability. The Hellcat was optimized for energy combat, boom and zoom tactics, hit-and-run attacks. The Hellcat's optimization matched the realities of 1944 combat. The Zero's optimization did not. By mid-1945, the Hellcat evaluation program's findings are academic. The war is ending. Japan's air forces are shattered. The few remaining experienced pilots are hoarded for kamikaze missions, their lives traded for ships in desperation attacks. The Zeros still flying are piloted by teenagers with 50 hours of training, sent on one-way missions, told to crash into enemy ships because they cannot win conventional fights. The Americans have achieved absolute air superiority. Hellcats range over Japan unopposed, strafing trains, bombing factories, destroying anything that moves. The captured Hellcats tested so carefully in 1944 are hidden in caves, irrelevant museum pieces, before the war even ends. The test pilots who flew them are scattered, dead, or like Genda, planning Japan's defense against the inevitable invasion. After Japan's surrender in August 1945, the occupation forces discover the evaluation reports during document seizures. American intelligence analysts read them with mixed feelings, validation that their designs were successful, but also respect for the thoroughness and honesty of the Japanese analysis. The reports are translated and distributed to American aircraft manufacturers, who study them to understand how their designs were perceived by enemy pilots. Grumman Aircraft, manufacturer of the Hellcat, receives copies of the reports and is particularly pleased. The Hellcat's design philosophy, ruggedness and reliability over elegance, is vindicated. The F6 F5, the model evaluated at Yokosuka in late 1944, continues in U.S. Navy service until 1954, a testament to the design's enduring value. The Zero is retired immediately after the war, obsolete, a relic of a different era. Some are preserved in museums. Most are scrapped. The few that survive are restored and flown by collectors, beautiful and graceful and completely outclassed by any modern aircraft. Genda survives the war, goes on to serve in the post-war Japanese self-defense forces, eventually achieving the rank of general. He is interviewed many times about his wartime experiences. He always mentions the Hellcat evaluation as a turning point in his understanding of the war. In a 1974 interview near the end of his life, he says, "We designed the Zero to fight the war we imagined. The Americans designed the Hellcat to fight the war that actually existed. That is the difference between fantasy and reality. We were trapped in fantasy. They lived in reality." Reality 1. Genda dies in 1989, age 84. His memoirs, published posthumously, include detailed descriptions of the Hellcat flights, his impressions, his frustrations that his warnings were ignored. He writes, "I learned from flying the Hellcat that engineering is destiny. A nation can have the bravest pilots, the most brilliant tactics, the strongest will to fight. But if that nation's industry cannot build aircraft that match the enemy's aircraft, that nation will lose. We lost not because we lacked courage. We lost because we lacked factories." The broader lesson of the Hellcat evaluation is about the nature of technological competition in warfare. Nations develop weapons based on their understanding of future combat, their industrial capabilities, and their strategic culture. Sometimes these designs succeed, sometimes they fail. When they fail, the cost is measured in lives. The Zero failed not because it was a bad design, but because it was a design optimized for circumstances that changed. The Hellcat succeeded not because it was a radical innovation, but because it was a practical solution to an understood problem. The Americans identified what they needed: speed, protection, firepower, reliability, and built it. The Japanese identified what they thought they needed: range, maneuverability, lightness, and built it. Both nations succeeded in building what they intended. But the Americans intended correctly. The Japanese did not. Intentions matter less than outcomes. The Hellcat won because it was designed to win the war that happened, not the war that was imagined. The story of Japanese pilots testing captured Hellcats is ultimately a story about the cost of denial. The test pilots saw the truth, documented the truth, reported the truth. The truth was ignored because it was inconvenient, because it contradicted cherished beliefs, because acting on it would require admitting error. This pattern, seeing truth and choosing to ignore it, is not unique to Japan or to World War II. It is a universal human tendency, organizational, cultural, political. But in war, this tendency kills. The Japanese pilots who flew inferior aircraft because their leadership refused to acknowledge reality paid with their lives. Thousands of them. Tens of thousands. Young men, skilled and brave, sent to fight battles they could not win. Flying aircraft that could not compete, because the adults in charge could not face uncomfortable facts. This is the real tragedy. Not that Japan lost. Not that the Zero was inferior. But that the people who knew better, who had evidence, who wrote reports, were not listened to. Their voices, like the voices of whistleblowers and truthfulers in every era, were suppressed by systems that valued conformity over accuracy. The F-6F Hellcat's production numbers tell their own story. 12,275 aircraft built between 1942 and 1945. The Hellcat accounted for 5,223 enemy aircraft destroyed, more than any other Allied naval aircraft. Its kill ratio was 19-1, the best of any American fighter of the war. These numbers are not accidents. They reflect design decisions made in 1941 and 1942. Decisions informed by combat experience, decisions prioritizing practical effectiveness over theoretical performance. The Japanese tested the Hellcat in 1944 and confirmed what American pilots already knew. The aircraft worked. It worked reliably. It worked consistently. It worked under the worst conditions. And because it worked, pilots came home. Pilots survived to fly again, to accumulate experience, to become veterans. The Americans built an air force of veterans flying reliable aircraft. The Japanese built an air force of novices flying fragile aircraft. The outcome was never in doubt. The Hellcat evaluation is one chapter in a much larger story of technological warfare, industrial capacity, and the human beings caught between engineering and ideology. If you want more untold histories like this, stories built on primary sources and declassified documents, subscribe right now. We're digging through archives every week to bring you what other channels miss. Thanks for listening.